Okay, everybody, thank you for coming along here today. This is the June edition of the NERI Seminar Series. Today we have Paul Goldrick-Kelly, who is part of our team here at NERI, usually based in the Dublin office, between the Dublin office and the London office, I guess. He's a graduate of UCD with a HDip and MA in economic science. And he's looked at a lot of areas, from healthcare to housing to tax reform to productivity performance. And his current research interests are in relation to ecological sustainability and political economy, incorporating issues related to just transition. And he is currently engaged in a collaborative doctoral research project with Maynooth University concerning carbon lock-in and its manifestation and propagation through institutions. The work is funded in partnership with the Irish Research Council. And just to say before I forget at the end, the next NERI seminar will take place on the 20th of September. We'll be joined by Dr. Damien Thomas from NESC, who will present on an opportunity to review and reframe industrial relations and collective bargaining. Details will be on the NERI website. So Paul will speak for around 30 minutes, I think. And then we will move to a Chatham House question and answer session. So with that, I will hand you over to Paul.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Sorry, make sure. Oh, this is set up. Okay, so as Tom mentioned in the introduction there, this is part of a collaborative piece of work, a broader project. So this is just in the initial phase. And to sort of contextualize what I'm going to present here, it's a bit of it's more so than kind of offering any definitive explanation as to carbon lock-in occurring in Ireland right now. This is setting out the framework I'm going to use to begin investigating that question. And the idea is to essentially take different literatures and get them to sort of complement one another, to see what we can kind of garner from each and kind of fill in the gaps in each kind of theoretical outlook. So with that in mind, give you a tiny bit of the background. That's the usual piece that you'll probably get in anything related to climate change. Things are bad. I'm sorry, but I have to do it. Then I'm going to introduce some of the basic concepts around path dependency, carbon lock-in, that concept. I'll set out the framework that's usually used in this social transitions studies. And then I'm going to introduce other sort of theories that I think can fill in aspects of that to kind of make explicit theoretically what's implicit in that usually used framework and really kind of politicize it, including kind of at the level of institutions at the sectoral level and then the wider political economy, and then I'll conclude. So to begin with the background there, despite, and this I'll refer to this in a slide, but you may have seen in recent reporting saying that despite the fact that Ireland has moved, from a situation where we didn't really, at least, kind of politically, discursively, talk about climate change that much, that's changed. There's a consensus about that. There isn't really much denialism going on, although I mean there might still be to some degree, but that isn't really the primary issue here. And we also have written into law things like the carbon budgets, etc. But despite that, the Republic of Ireland in particular is still a laggard. Indeed, we're still seeing emissions growth according to the latest data. So what's going on? Usually, people point to the presence of low carbon technologies. Given their presence, the fact that we all agree that climate change is an issue, what's happening here? If this is essentially about deploying new tech, why haven't we seen more progress? And that leads you to questions of transition. What factors aid or impede them, and why are some states performing better than others? Now, I should say this kind of background, this setup, this is more what I'm going to answer in the broader project, but this is the beginnings and outline of a framework to try and answer those questions. So to look into that a bit more, you might have seen in this reportage, the EPA recently looking at government's current kind of environmental policies, as well as with added measures, projection framework, both sets, even including, policy that the government hasn't implemented, imply that we're way off targets. Now, this chart, they have the proviso on it that it says that this assumes that carbon budgets are equally divided amongst all the years, but you can see we're wildly, that blue line is, you could take it as an optimistic scenario, it's nowhere near where it needs to be. And similarly, this kind of relates to the broader framework of the project, which is looking at doing a sort of comparative analysis of Ireland relative to two other small states, specifically, as in this chart, Austria and Sweden. Ireland, while we've fallen back from our highs of aggregate emissions that occurred during the 2000s, we're still well above where we were in 1990, whereas Austria is about where they were in 1990 and Sweden is doing far better. And these are otherwise fairly similar states, comparably developed, etc. So it raises questions of why. One direction that's taken in this transitions literature is kind of building on the concept of path dependency here. And this really emerges within evolutionary economics. There's also a sort of institutional turn in economics where we begin to look at outcomes. And in some kind of key outputs over the mid to late 80s, they look at technologies, and in particular, they observe that widely adopted technologies aren't always the best ones. They aren't always optimally efficient. And the classic example that's often given in that seminal piece from Davids in 1985 is the QWERTY keyboard. That keyboard setup has had alternatives arise that are apparently much more efficient in writing, but the fact that everybody uses the QWERTY keyboard has been enough to build an inertia against replacing it. It's too embedded, it's too assumed. And Arthur then points to these kind of self-reinforcing dynamics that can lead to this sort of path dependency occurring. So you have large setup or fixed costs, learning effects, learning by doing. So that initial advantage that you get confers advantages progressively as you move along. Coordination effects, the classic ones being, network effects that you benefit from other people using it, or particularly other infrastructures arising. So if you have software in a computer, if it's coupled with the hardware of that computer, that entrenches its use. And even the idea that people start to pick winners. If you observe other people using a technology or an option, you'll adopt it because you don't want to be left behind. So crucially, this idea is that history matters, although that's often a fairly trite thing to say, but particularly the second part is that once you start upon a particular path, the probability of remaining on that path increases and the cost of switching rises. That's this positive feedback tendency. So that feeds into that work in the early 2000s. Jason Unruh introduces the idea of carbon lock-in, and that is the application of this path-dependent process in terms of carbon-intensive infrastructures. So it refers to this mutually reinforcing dynamic between social, economic, and physical factors. And in a review piece a few years back, there's been they identified three main kind of varieties in the literature. You have the technology infrastructure side. That's what we often think of. That's, a stranded asset, a coal plant. But there are also behavioral lock-ins. People come to expect and routinize, the use of these technologies. And from the perspective of my project, the one I'll focus on, this idea of institutional lock-in. And I think institutions are interesting here because they have some distinct properties in relation to the other ones. In a sense, there's often disagreement on what an institution is, but what we can agree it really is, it's something meant to lock in an outcome, really. That's what institutions exist to do. They're inherently political, and that implies that actors within political systems, they want to maintain a status quo or shift to a new one. And one framework just to introduce in this social technical transitions literature that this carbon lock-in is related to, it's the multi-level perspective. And that sees changes occurring. You have three levels from the small to the largest scale. So in the middle, you have this thing called the social technical system. That's a system that's operating to fulfill some social needs. So you might refer to something like a transport system. Landscape would be everything else around it. Niche innovation might be, in the case of a new technology entrant, a new particular technology that's trying to build up. And just to skip forward for a second to give you a sense of it, you can think of a social technical system as having the dimensions of your institutions, rules, techno-economic components and flows. That's, materials, built infrastructures, and the economics of it, as well as the actors involved. And these transition changes occur generally when you have kind of concurrent dynamics at these levels. So generally how it's explained is somebody introduced a new niche at that micro level, builds up momentum, there's pressure at this level, or maybe at the higher landscape level, they put pressure on an existing sectoral system, and this destabilization creates a window for this new disruptive technology. And then as we get into the sort of the standard phases, you have the initial phase, you have experimentation, which is trial and learning. You're trying to build these niches, acceptance, feasibility. All of your coalitions, networks, and visions are all kind of at the emergent stage. You're trying to just fill in, those pieces. Stabilization occurs as you start to build that momentum and gain a foothold. Diffusion disruption is when you get to a scale, either at the level of economic competitiveness or coalitions and groups invested in what you're doing, that you come to challenge incumbents. And then institutionalization anchoring is when you've effectively locked in your technological alternative. And that raises this kind of process, raises these kind of lock-in dynamics. You have techno-economic ones, as I mentioned, some that we recognize, sunk investments, just the material persistence of infrastructure. You build a road, that's a long-lasting thing. Cost, performance, this is cheaper to operate. Social and cognitive, people are used to the use of this technological setup. And institution political, so the existing regulation standards favor the current system, or incumbents have access to things like the policy-making process. Now, this system has been criticized, so it's been adjusted somewhat, because in many cases it sort of sees a breakthrough technology emerging, and that's where the action in the story is. But you can adjust that framework so that transition can occur within the system. Incumbents might have incentives to change, or you might have multiple niche innovations, which is probably more realistic when we're talking about something as complicated as climate change. It's not a single technology that'll do the work for us. And an interaction between multiple systems. Indeed, like the electricity system as it exists in Ireland, we have the generation level, transmission, distribution, all of which can be conceived as different systems with different things going on, or between indeed something like electricity and transport. Change can be gradual, so it isn't simply that a crisis occurs which causes rapid change, although that can occur, but we shouldn't be favoring kind of one over the other, or at least we shouldn't be blind to change occurring in that way. And existing social technical systems, incumbents aren't monoliths. There can be tensions between them which drive changes. So they add a framework for dynamics within existing systems, reconfiguration, reorientation, policy reconfiguration. So what am I looking to do here? So as I've outlined in that kind of prior framework, which I think is useful, but that prior framework tends to focus on technology and adoption as it's the central point of entry. This is what you're focused on. What happens with that technology? Can you break through, etc.? But for the purpose of this analysis, I want to look at institutions at the middle and upper layers where I introduced there. So that social technical system, that's a tangible system, say like transport, but also the landscape. So wider political economy, what's happening in the wider world, what sort of forces might be acting to inhibit or promote change. As I mentioned in the slides here, that gives you something tangible at the level of sector, while you can also look at macro scale factors. So institutionalism and wider political economy can fill in the framework here. So to introduce historical institutionalism, that's a distinct strand within institutional studies, which all have kind of various frameworks, various kind of ways of looking at institutions, where rational choice might be something more like an economic approach, where you have an individual actor who's responding to incentives, discursive or sociological, which more about culture and frames, how those operate. But historical institutionalism is more kind of pointing to two big concerns, which I think are consistent with kind of broader political economy, agency within institutional constraints, and how are institutions formed and how do they evolve. So moving on, I think that this framework is a useful complement to the multi-level perspective that I outlined there, that offers insight into mechanisms of inertia at the level of institutions. You can relate to specific institutions within sectors, or we can refer to something broader than that, like wider political economy. And it tends to be in the other approach, the MLP, you take a case study approach, whereas I think this historical institutional perspective lets you set different country cases against each other to maybe take out some patterns, identify some patterns. And we might be able to identify arrangements that might be more or less successful when it comes to a low carbon transition. And just to venture into literature, some kind of pointers that they offer for institutional inertia, etc. Pearson, he looks at the institutional kind of analog to that economic path-dependent process that I outlined at the beginning of the presentation. He says the positive feedback can occur in politics. Indeed, it might be especially prone to these kind of dynamics. The need for collective action that imposes high entry costs for new entrants. Institutional setups, they make reversals unattractive. You make investments and you even form identities on that basis. And actors are likely to use their power to change the rules to maintain their power or increase it. And it's difficult to kind of assess outcomes when it comes, given the complexity of politics. The literature also points to different types of institutional change. So rather than simply that, crisis model where change suddenly occurs, you can have different models of institutional change that occur more or less slowly in different contexts. Displacement, the removal or replacement of old rules, layering, you introduce new rules alongside old ones, drift, the impact of existing rules changes, and conversion. Former rules are interpreted or enacted in different ways, and that gives you a lot of flexibility in your interpretation of institutional change. And just so venturing then into literature where historical institutionalism has been applied to look at environmental performance, some factors that they point out that might be relevant in the analysis here. The research suggests that countries with proportional representation, they're more likely to adopt environmental policy than first past the post systems for a variety of reasons. More favorable to small parties like the Green Party, various Green parties. And other frameworks look at it as there's less of a cost applied to an incumbent government for imposing green policy that might be unpopular. Other factors include the presence or non-presence of veto players. So your constitutional arrangements, the idea that it might be a presidential or parliamentary system or a federal system matters here, but that can cut in both ways. So I just cite the example, the German Länder. They defended the feed-in tariff that was in place in 1994, even as major energy utilities were trying to overturn it. Another relevant factor is the extent to which decision-making is delegated, particularly in regulation. So you've introduced a new veto player, and that matters given their outlooks, if they're not consistent with change, and if they have a high latitude of action. We can expect a lot more inertia at that level. And it also matters the particulars of those arrangements. Is it that this independent regulator reports to a minister? That implies more direct political control, for example. Other factors include consultation, so the idea that you have kind of corporatist arrangements, that you get people around a table talking, enables bargaining between policymakers and those who lose out, according to Finnegan, and that helps overcome opposition, making for a more stable kind of green policy outlook. There's some recent work finding that state-owned utilities, so ownership might matter here. They found in the EU that state-owned utilities dedicate higher shares of investment to renewables, but that's particularly the case where you have stringent climate policy, high regulatory quality. If those aren't in place, you could see state-owned utilities perhaps not going in that direction if the government didn't emphasize green policy. And this broader framework, it suggests that this institutional setup can result in variations of how powerful incumbents are, how they express that power, their interests, and the ease of policy or regulatory capture. And so to kind of then move to getting to that bigger scale, in terms of institutions, that macro level. The idea of institutional complementarity, I think, is significant here. So that refers to the presence or form of an institution in one area can reinforce other institutions elsewhere. And that is a central idea in really models of comparative capitalism. It isn't simply just random combinations of institutions, but particular ones are tied together via this complementarity. And that itself could be a source of path dependency and lock-in, since they reinforce each other and they lead to persistence. And kind of now segueing into the next slide here to institutional hierarchy, it doesn't imply that all these complementary institutions are at sort of an equal level. Some may play a more decisive role relative to others. That's where institutional hierarchy comes in, and it reflects a balance of power. But crucially, that doesn't mean that this outcome or this hierarchy is completely intentional, and it can tie into issues of complementarity. So in some accounts of change in sort of varieties of capitalism or kind of strategies of accumulation, the Fordist era, your leading kind of economic strategy is related to wage-led growth. That shaped how other institutional forms sort of respond to it. They're meant to be complementary. But as that changed, maybe as what some people call, the neoliberal era arises, wage, labor, and social protection institutions, they start changing to kind of reflect the influence of finance, say. Okuma, so in a study looking at sort of the Japanese context, he argues that generally that environment, economy, institutional sort of setup, that's lower down the priority list. And it's the way it develops is complementary to other kind of higher forms that dominate here. And in sort of this complementarity hierarchy, these ideas, they may have negative implications when it comes to lock-in, but it might also imply that addressing issues in some of these kind of institutional setups might actually lead to win-wins. If there's interlinkages between if a given institutional setup, say export-led growth, is both, for example, not asserting this, but if it's both, leading to higher inequality and problems on the ecological side, perhaps addressing that will lead to progress in both areas. And this hierarchy complementarity, that's where we get to this wider comparative political economy perspective. You can look at how setups differ between different places. Clearly, Swedish capitalism looks different from Irish capitalism in many ways, and a way of seeing change over time. The strategies that different countries undertake for economic success has clearly changed over time, and there are major strands that sort of examine this in various ways. You have the varieties of capitalism approach, that might be the most common one. You have a basic two-type split between liberal market economies, coordinated market economies, depending on the degree of coordination between firms. Bruno Amabile has a five-type typology, building on the regulation school. You have comparative welfare, state studies, institutions differ in product markets, labor relations, social protection, education, financial systems. So it sees it as a constellation of different institutions. More recent work that sort of, I think it generally is called the kind of growth model literature. They emphasize sources of demand to sort of explain the institutions. And you also have composite approaches that look at essentially kind of insights from all of these different schools. And now just to outline, some work that's been done in comparative political economy and linking that to various environmental outcomes. So these might be pointers in terms of my analysis. Within the varieties of capitalism framework, you have arguments that essentially those coordinated market economies do better for various reasons. That can be in terms of shareholder value governance in liberal market economies leads to more short-termism and a reluctance really to invest in something long-term with limited payoff, like environmental R&D, for example. Those classic accounts that say, Germany's success in sort of renewable R&D is related to their particular setup, where there's coordination between industry, the government, educational institutions, funders, etc., which gives them an advantage. Although some caution that this can more or less apply to different sectors, so you shouldn't simply apply this to every sector of the economy. And other approaches, looking at green issues, such as Can-Foro, they take the social relationship to the environment as an explicit new element to try and kind of group and sort different economies into different types. So, leading back into my overall framework, I think there's potential really within each of these sort of different lines of thinking for a lot of kind of complementary work to occur here. So I think that sustainability transitions framework, that 3-level analysis that I outlined briefly, that gives you some specificity. So that technological side, specific sector issues, that does matter. And so it's useful to kind of have that information, look at potential specific issues within those sectors, and you can analyze various levels to see how factors might align to aid transition efforts. On the other hand, institutionalism and political economy can fill in pieces of the mid to bigger level picture. So as I say there, this combined approach might politicize that multi-level framework and green historical institutionalism or political economy. And as I said before, hopefully, if we see things like complementarities or hierarchies as occurring here, maybe we can solve certain issues one stroke. Maybe we have win-wins that could occur here. So to conclude, just a few slides. I think we're coming in before time, so that's good. So this lock-in path dependency approach, that can draw attention to the fact that these transition problems are linked. This is a system problem. This institutionalism and wider political economy focus, you have a different window than the typical technical focus. But it's good to keep a grips on that technical focus, to keep an eye on specifics. So combining that higher level focus on institutional configurations, we can see possible unforeseen effects of economic strategies, and comparative analysis can point to institutions and wider complementarities that might lead to more success. So we might see in other contexts success that we could perhaps emulate, or institutions that we might emulate, importantly. And as mentioned, concepts like complementarities and hierarchies in institutions, the relationship to politics, that could be very relevant here and sort of lead to questions or possible answers to questions like, how might we build a constituency for climate policies? And how might, if institutions are meant to lock in outcomes, all lock-ins might not be bad. How might we lock in something desirable, something sustainable? This approach, depending on what we find now, again, this is a framework, so this may be more or less true in Ireland or other places, but it might potentially imply that piecemeal institutional change might not be enough to get us where we want to go. And maybe, as mentioned, we might have win-wins. So those few questions, I think that relates really to what we might call in the labour movement the just transition idea. I think those are very relevant there. There's also similar concepts that lock-in has sort of been intuited, or something equivalent comes up in a lot of other fields, such as political ecology or development studies, and that might be also useful here. So that might lend itself. And I think many kind of different perspectives are particularly useful if you're dealing with something as complicated as climate change, that kind of wicked problem. So I'll leave things there.